This is Mark McNeese, and you're listening to One Thing or Another, interviews and conversations. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. This is your host, Mark McNeese, and today I have a guest on that I'm excited to talk about. His name is Professor David Yamane. He is a professor of sociology at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He earned his BA in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley and his MS, and PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. In a departure from his previous work, Professor Yamane has undertaken a study of American gun culture, exploring the phenomenon of armed citizenship as part of what has been called Gun Culture 2.0, a new group of individuals, including an increasing number of women, who have entered gun culture through concealed carry, self-defense, and the shooting sports. Professor Yamane, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I found you through it's an organization called the Liberal Gun Club that I joined. I'm not a gun owner. I live with somebody, my husband, who is I don't think would want me. He just doesn't want me to have a gun. But I don't have a problem with guns, and it's one of the reasons I joined the Liberal Gun Club, because I wanted to be supportive of a different perspective. It's so polarized in our culture, and people think you're either for or against. It all seems to be on the extremes to me, but obviously it isn't, and it's one of the things that you study. Can you give us start by giving us the Cliff Notes version of Professor Yamane? Who, where, and what?
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. I grew up really largely outside of any contact with guns themselves or any kind of gun culture. And as I got into sociology, as you might know, sociology being a pretty liberal field within academia, which is already pretty liberal. And so as I went to school in California, Wisconsin, and then worked in Indiana, even though Wisconsin and Indiana have fairly robust gun cultures, I've managed to stay within my sociology bubble and avoided any kind of contact with guns. But then when I moved to North Carolina in 2005, I really started noticing, much more guns kind of around me. It seemed much more common for people to have guns, to talk about guns, to see billboards for gun stores and gun shows. And so that was really an eye-opener for me and was really my first inkling of, getting interested in this thing called guns and gun culture.
That bleeds into my second question, which was how you got interested in the subject. And then how did you start out once you wanted to study this or wanted to examine it? How did you go about it?
Yeah, so I think, there were a couple of different influences on me. And the first was kind of, again, recognizing that there was a thing called gun culture and that a lot of people who I thought of as being normal people, people I played tennis with, IT people, my real estate agent, they all, spoke about guns as just a normal part of life. And then I also, when I was living in an apartment complex for a period, had a interaction in the parking lot there, which was pretty disruptive to my sense of safety and security. And so, those kind of things both came together to a moment where I went out and just tried shooting a gun for the first time. And I didn't really approach that as a moment where I was like, I need to get into guns. Mm-hmm. It was more like, guns are around and they're a bit scary and I ought to know how they work. But I actually enjoyed that time shooting the gun for the first time. So, that was my entry into actually kind of, shooting guns and being a gun owner. And around that same time, I was looking for a new research project because I just grew tired of working in the same field I had worked in for the previous 20 years. And so I thought, well, why not bring together this kind of new interest in guns with my need to start up a research project. And, that was in 2011. And I've been working, on this study of American gun culture ever since.
Did you find people to be welcoming and, oh, come on in, we'll show you how to do this. As somebody who hadn't shot a gun, because I was also wondering, in your first purchase of a gun, there's a gun store not far from here, and I mentioned there's a gun club up the road, because there's a lot of hunters around where I live, and I have wanted to go into the store many times. I also write murder mysteries, and I wanted to go in there just, as research, but I don't know. I worry about, like, what am I going to feel like? Are they going to peg me as a liberal? I mean, how were people towards you when you wanted to learn about guns?
Yeah, I think that I had a nice point of entry because my wife, Sandy, grew up near where we live now in the town that is sometimes considered the most redneck town in the state of North Carolina. And so she had a lot of connections with locals, people who actually were gun trainers, people who held shooting events, and people who owned outfitters that sold fishing gear and guns. So I was able to kind of, infiltrate myself into that community fairly easy because of her entree. But I think that people do have different sorts of experiences. Many gun stores, gun ranges you go into, you may be confronted with, a huge Trump flag on the wall and Fox News playing endlessly on the TVs. And obviously that's not a very comfortable environment for a lot of people. And so I think those of us who are more on the liberal end of guns politically, who own guns, often are on the lookout for places that are comfortable for people from a diverse set of backgrounds. So I couldn't guarantee that if you went into your local gun store that you would feel comfortable. I don't think you would be in any danger. So think it's worth going in. But if you did know someone who was a gun owner, who was a member of that gun club, or a hunter you knew who could go in with you, that might grease the skids a bit.
Well, we know the guys at women, there's women down there too. We know the gun club very well because they wanted to buy our land at one point. But we see them all the time, and we talk to them, and they're really a nice group, great group of people. So I know that they have invited us there. So if I ever wanted to say, hey, I've never shot a gun, and actually I have shot a shotgun, but they would be more than happy to initiate me. That's not a problem. I think it has more to do with the way I perceive myself.
Sure.
How am I looking at me as I walk into a store where I can buy something, a murder weapon. But I'm making a joke there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not surprised to hear that, the people at the gun club are welcoming because, I think the large majority of gun owners realize that, one of the best ways to sort of protect the right to own guns is to have a large percentage of the population feel positively about them and think of them not as, murder weapons, but as thinking of as self-defense weapons and things that you can have fun with. And, so a friend of mine has a saying that, there's no such thing as the anti-gun range. So if you can just get people, to the range and get them to experience firearms in a safe and controlled environment, not everyone is going to be a convert to gun ownership, but at least they have a better understanding of what guns are all about.
Yeah, my real interest in them, because I'm not a hunter, is self-defense. I would like to at least be able to have that as a self-defense instrument. And I also think that in like I mentioned earlier, in our culture currently, it just seems to be either or, and that's why I was happy to find a liberal gun club. I think there are probably a lot of people who would say, what? There would be such a disconnect for them that not everyone who owns a gun or wants to own a gun it belongs to the NRA, and wants to permitless carry in New York City. I mean, it's really it's more complex than that.
Yeah. Well, the loudest voices are the ones who often, occupy most of the media space, whereas, there are a lot of people who are more in, what we might think of as being that broad middle ground, including, I would say, people like yourself who I use the term gun curious to describe. So, if you look at the gun population in the United States, about a third of the population owns firearms, and about a third doesn't own firearms and say they would never own firearms, and about a third are in the middle who they don't currently own firearms, but they don't rule it out in the future. So that's a sizable part of the population who are thinking about, or at least open to the possibility of gun ownership at some point in the future.
And if I remember, when I was looking at your statistics that you had on one of your videos, it seemed like even with the percentage of people who own guns, they own multiple guns, because there were 400 million guns, but there weren't 400 million gun owners.
Yeah. Yeah, the average gun owner owns about five guns.
Wow.
So, it's not an even distribution, or, it's not like a bell curve around 5, though, because you have a lot of people who own one, and then you have people who own, 10 or 15 or more. But on average, it is 5.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the concealed carry revolution that you're talking right about, and now the permitless carry movement. Because the NRA started out as training people to use rifles. I mean, it did not start out as a political organization. It's certainly not the way it is now. And when did this whole gun culture transition from being items of hunting to items of self-defense and where I'm going, permitless carry, all of that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I always like to start by saying that self-defense has always been a reason for gun ownership in the United States, all the way back into the prehistory of the country. But there was a shift as the country developed, much more toward the centrality of hunting. And here, I talk about sort of recreational hunting, not hunting to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But recreational hunting and sport shooting and collecting really became kind of the core passions of people who were involved in guns. And that continued up into, I'd say, through the 1960s. And the 1960s, as in so many ways in our country, was, a kind of pivotal decade. It was a time of a lot of social instability, of social change, protest movements, and I think also a rising crime rate. So that was the milieu within which the gun culture 2.0, as I call it, began to develop. And it continued into the 70s, and then by the time you reach the 1980s, you have this concealed carry movement, which had started before the 80s, but really the pivotal moment was when Florida passed their shall issue concealed carry laws, and that really set in motion this revolution that spread across the country, and then subsequently is transitioned now from a shall issue concealed carry to permitless carry. So it's really the gun culture 2.0 has been developing since the 1960s. I think that the NRA is obviously a part of that, but it's not the only part of it, and oftentimes it's not even the most important part. The civilian gun training industry developed sort of independently of the NRA. Sometimes the NRA has been not on the leading edge of legal developments, like in the Heller decision. So I wouldn't downplay the importance of the NRA, but I also wouldn't kind of equate everything that's happening in the world of guns with the NRA.
Thank you. I appreciate that distinction. And what is shall carry? I mean shall issue. I'm sorry.
Sure. So we've gone through different stages in the ability to carry a concealed weapon in the United States. So up into the early 1800s. It was legal to do so, but then there was a movement towards restricting concealed carry, because it was thought that really only criminals and people with bad intentions would carry a concealed weapon, like honorable people would carry their weapons openly. And so, into the 20th century, you had the basically bans on carrying concealed weapons, and then shifted into what we would consider discretionary carry laws, or may issue. So the local authorities have the ability to decide who can carry a weapon concealed and who can't. That's what you have in New Jersey, New York, California. These are sort of the may issue states. And then starting 1960 was Washington State became the first shall issue state. Florida in 1986, the most sort of widely known. But shall issue basically says if you meet the statutory requirements to carry a concealed firearm, then the issuing authority shall issue you that permit or license. That they don't have discretion to say you don't have good cause to carry, or you're not a good person, like you don't have good moral character. So, if you are a person who can legally own a firearm, if you have a clean criminal record, you don't have, mental health issues. So those kind of considerations, once you meet those criteria, they have to issue you a permit. And then, of course, permitless carry has taken that even further, which is basically to say, if you can legally own a firearm, then you can legally carry that firearm concealed in public. But again, with certain restrictions, you still can't carry it on school grounds or in places that are posted no carry, or courthouses, government buildings. But
how recent is permitless carry?
Permitless carry goes back into the 1990s when Alaska was the first state to allow permitless carry, but it really has taken off just in the last 5 years. So you had Alaska and then Arizona over, and kind of early adopters, but it was really in the last 5 years after shall issue, had kind of gone every place that shall issue could go. Then states that were shall issue started saying, hey, why not just go permitless? So it's even in 2021 there were 5 states that went shall issue, or permitless carry, just in the year 2021.
Now, when I hear
a couple more considering it now, so it's an ongoing movement.
When I hear permitless carry, probably a lot of people also, I just want to understand that, because when I hear that, I think this is somebody, they're not required to have training. They're not required to have anything. Just go in and buy a gun and carry it concealed, and then you have Pennsylvania, states like that, where it's open carry and they can come into the grocery store where I work with a gun on their hip and there's nothing we can do. Is that true? There's absolutely no requirement other than not being a felon or something that would prevent them from buying a gun?
Yeah, that's how the permitless carry idea goes. Is it's sort of the right. It sort of adds the bear arms into the right to keep and bear arms. So, the idea being if you are a good enough citizen to own a gun, then you're also a good enough citizen to carry that gun concealed in public. And it's interesting you mentioned the open carry states, because North Carolina is also an open carry state. So for decades, over a century, North Carolina banned concealed carry, but it had never banned open carry of firearms. And again, I think it goes back to that idea that an honorable person, would carry their weapon openly, whether it's a sword or a knife or a gun. And that really, if someone's openly carrying a firearm, they're unlikely to be a criminal. Now, you may disagree with that, but a lot of people in the gun culture are not fans of open carry for lots of different reasons, but including because they know it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's only been one gentleman who actually comes into the store with his guns. And I wanted to stay away from debate with you, because that's not why I wanted you on. But I will say that what you're saying right now, it's like, I have an issue with not being required to be trained even, or no kind of license. It's like the honorable thing, it doesn't go with a car. You can't just buy and drive a car because you're an honorable person. That's like insane to me. But that's part of what is going on in the country.
Well, let me also say, I don't, I think we're having, a conversation, and that, I don't take people raising questions like the question you just raised as sort of debating that, that
Oh
there
yeah, oh no,
is a
no, you're
range
right.
of
It
views
was a poor choice of
on
words. I'm
this.
sorry. But what I meant was
I think that we need to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, I had wanted to not get myself. I didn't want to get too far into a political perspective on it. But I can see why so many people are like, "This is crazy." You can't buy a car. You can't drive a car. It's like I that's why people don't understand it. That's why so many people are like, these people are insane. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm not opposed to guns. And when at work, we do these modules and, for waste management and how to do this, how to do your job, basically. And the newest module was on how to respond to an active shooter. And I'm like, there's something just weird about living in a country where that's now part of the workplace. You have to be trained on how not to get killed by a lunatic with a gun,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that those are, legitimate concerns that people have. And yeah, there are certainly, people within the gun culture who are, from my dead hands, Molan Labe, pounding fists and pounding chests. And, I don't feel like they do much for the cause of the bulk of gun owners who, are not so fervent, or at least, would like to help try to explain to their non-gun owning neighbors, why what they do makes sense.
Right. And then I also, what was this? Concealed carry. I lost my train of thought there. Just that. Oh yeah. I was going to say the other thing, one last thing on that is that with the either or, mentality that we have with so many people, if I say that I want, this has happened more than once when I've said, ostensible gun legislation, this and that and the other thing. It's assumed that I hate guns and that I don't want to have anything to do with guns, and that's not true. I think most gun owners, like you have said, support sane legislation, safety legislation. That most people don't want a free for all when it comes to firearms, and yet I'm seen as somebody who hates guns because I think that we should have regulations around them.
Yeah. Well, I think that the question isn't should we regulate guns or not. It's how much should we regulate them, because we already regulate guns. We're talking about it's people who can carry permitless have to be able to legally own a gun, and there are lots of restrictions on who can legally own a gun. So, it's, again, I don't think it's a question of regulate or not. It's a question of, which regulations, are the ones that we can live with, which ones are going to give us the most bang for the buck, so to speak. And then also on the other side, which ones create sort of an undue burden on the law-abiding gun owners in order to sort of stamp out the misbehavior by some other folks.
Okay, yeah. Now you wrote about just a couple more questions here. You wrote about safety with guns versus safety from guns, and I'm just asking you if you can expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we've seen the adoption by sort of gun control or gun violence prevention advocates of this hashtag gun safety. So they, talk about themselves as a gun safety movement. And my response to that is that nobody is against gun safety. There's no organization out there that's promoting criminal or unintentional gun harm. So, gun safety is something that everybody largely can agree on as a positive thing, but not everybody sees gun safety the same way. So I think people within the gun culture largely focus on how can we live safely with guns? How can we have rules of gun safety training programs? I'm a NRA certified range safety officer, so I have the ability to safely run a gun range or supervise a gun range, and so I think that's one version of gun safety, is how do we safely live with guns and use guns. And I think that a lot of the focus of the gun violence prevention movement is safety from guns. So they really see guns as a mechanism of injury and death. And so trying to figure out ways of getting guns away from people or people away from guns. Mm-hmm. So I call that, safety from guns. Then, because the logic really, the underlying logic really is that guns are dangerous, and they pose risk on people, and that if you want to eliminate that risk, you have to eliminate the guns. So I think when we hear gun safety, we can all say yes, gun safety, but then we have to dig a little further to make sure we understand gun safety in the same ways.
Well, and I also think it would do people well to watch some of your videos and see some of the statistics that you have that sort of refute this idea that every other person in this country is being killed by gun violence, because it's not true. It was just fascinating. I like your videos a lot. I learned a lot from them. Where do you suppose we're heading in this country? I don't know if is that too broad a question?
Well, I know that a lot of people are concerned about where we're heading in this country, and as we head into a midterm election, and we see some of the things going on with gerrymandering of legislative districts. I know it's happening here in North Carolina and other places, that I think we're going to, we're setting ourselves up to have a political system, whether it's on the national level or on the state level, where we really are divided between red and blue. And I don't think that bodes well, for the country as a whole, for people to be able to, or to be forced to live in a state that's dominated by one of two political parties. And so, to the extent that guns have become a litmus test for whether you're red or blue, I think that the future of gun politics is going to be as bad as the future of politics in general in the United States. Maybe, even a kind of canary in the coal mine sort of issue. Though there are people, you mentioned the liberal gun club. There's also the liberal gun owners, African American gun clubs, Asian American gun clubs, LGBTQ gun clubs, really sort of representing the full diversity of gun owners. But it's very hard, if you're a liberal gun owner, you're going to have a hard time persuading your local Democratic member of the state house or congressional delegation, to have a view of guns that differ from what the National Democratic Party holds. And the same thing true from the other side. The Republican Party is, sort of all in on a particular view of guns, and, no, common Republican voter is going to persuade, the political party to do something otherwise. So, that's my somewhat pessimistic view of the future.
Thanks.
The other reality is that there are a lot of people coming into gun culture who are very diverse. There's, with this the great gun buying spree of 2020 and 2021, we've seen a large influx of Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, women, LGBT people, who are getting into gun ownership. That doesn't mechanically make them part of gun culture or, Second Amendment advocates. But
I don't blame them either. I mean, for years I've always sort of marveled at how, as soon as a Democrat makes it into the White House, the gun sales explode. So I've thought, well, it's about time that black folks and gay folks and everybody else started buying these things too, because they can be just as worried about what's coming down. And I had also read that the largest militia in the country was a black militia, and that fascinated me. I can't remember the name of it. It was probably the New York Times, and it was a profile of this militia. So that I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, I wish there was more middle ground. I think it helps to somebody like me who lives, I went from New York City to out here in rural New Jersey. It's a very Republican county, but I like my neighbors. My neighbors are great, and I don't ask them who they voted for, and a lot of them are gun owners. I'm assuming a lot of them are Republicans, but not all of them. And I don't know. It just helps to actually experience people from a different side, from a different world than the one that you inhabit.
Yeah, and it helps to experience people in real face-to-face communal relationships. Also, I think part of our problem is that we just take in so much information, through social media, which we know is set up to rile our emotions and to divide us politically. And sometimes we just need to turn off those screens and go out and talk to the person who lives down the street, and we may find we could disagree on a lot of things, but it's harder to sort of just get worked up and hate-filled when you're talking to someone face-to-face and you realize what you have in common.
Yes, and I think there are still too many people who don't, either they don't understand or they're not able to do something about the fact that social media and even the broader media, a lot of times the intention it's an emotional intention. They want to upset you. They want to enrage you. I see that a lot, even in some of the Washington Post, and sometimes I'm like, I can't read this today because there's too many triggers there, and I think it's deliberate a lot of times, especially in social media. I want to tell people that your where to find your website and your videos and learn more about you and what you're doing.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of things. After having just bashed social media, I do have a lot of things going. The positive side of trying to take advantage of the positive side of social media. But I think that the three most important for me are that I have two blogs. One is called Gun Culture 2.0. If you just Google any of these terms, they'll come up. I also have a second blog that I started that was really meant for people who weren't as bought into gun culture. It's called Gun Curious. And then I just this year started my YouTube channel called Light Over Heat. And the idea, that's always been my motto as long as I've been studying gun culture, is trying to bring light over heat. And so trying to capture some of those people who are tired of reading blogs and want to get ideas in a different sort of medium. So Light Over Heat is my YouTube channel. And again, if you Google that, you hopefully can find it.
Professor, it's been really good to talk to you. And I think one of these days, pretty soon, I'm going to walk over to the gun club and say, "Hey guys, I'd like to do some shooting," and go from there.
Yeah, that's like I said, whether you become a gun nut or not from that, it's still a great experience.
Thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate this, and I will look forward to your next video.
Thank you so much, and keep us posted on developments over at the gun club there.
Okay, you have a good day.
Bye.
You've been listening to One Thing or Another, interviews and conversations with your host, Mark McNeese, brought to you by Maidmark Publishing. Find us on iTunes, Amazon, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite podcasts.